Started. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I would ask that you please silence your cell phones. My name is Mariela Colon, and I'm a librarian with the Civic, Cultural, and Literary Engagement Department of the Adult Services team at the Chicago Public Library. Tonight's event is part of our Voices for Justice series, which is a slate of programs that will engage authors and thought leaders that spark conversation on the topic of social justice. Tonight's program is being live streamed, and we will be monitoring online chat for questions from the audience for a short Q&A following the conversation, if time allows. Please note there are books for sale courtesy of Staudenmaiers at the back of the room, and the author will sign books at the conclusion of the program. I'm now pleased to introduce our speakers for the evening. Dr. Michael Staudenmaier is a veteran of many anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, and anarchist projects over the past 3 decades, including work with anti-racist action in Chicago in the 90s and 2000s. He works as an assistant professor of history at Manchester University in North Manchester, Indiana, where he writes and teaches about race, racism, and anti-racism in United States history. He co-authored We Go Where They Go, the story of anti-racist action, and he's completing the manuscript of White, Black, Brown, Becoming Puerto Rican in Chicago, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. He serves on the executive committee of the Puerto Rican Studies Association and on the board of directors of Dr. Pedro Vizcampo Puerto Rican High School in Humboldt Park. He lives in the Austin neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. Michael will be in conversation with Dr. Lamiz Shawahin. Dr. Shawahin is the program coordinator for the MA in Psychology and an assistant professor at Governor State University. She earned her PhD from APA-accredited counseling and psychology program at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. She completed her pre-doctoral internship at Clement J. Zablocki VA Medical Center and postdoctoral fellowship at Edward Hines Jr. VA Medical Center. If we can give a round of applause for our speakers this evening and commence the program.
Are we on? I guess we are. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Before we began, Lamiz and I were talking about this, and we wanted to do, an acknowledgement of the continuing horror in Gaza right now, where more than 25,000 people have been killed, which amounts to more than 1% of the population. If that were happening in the United States right now, it would be 3 million people would be dead in the last 3 months. And a fairly newer statistic is that of all of the people in the world experiencing famine, 80% of them right now live in the Gaza Strip. So ARA did significant work in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, at least in some places and times, and that work needs to continue. So I just wanted to begin with that, with Free Palestine.
Ceasefire now, and we need to end the genocide. Okay, you're getting started. Cool. All right, so we're going to start with some questions that I have. So in the book, you talk a lot about how other organizations sort of take credit for efforts that, may have been influenced at least, at the very least, and maybe even, the direct result of ARA efforts. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could talk about 1 or 2 specific successes that the ARA could claim.
Sure. In thinking about that, I wanted to, maybe highlight one very specific particular thing, and then talk a little bit more broadly about some elements of what I think made ARA special. So the particular one, and it's the opening vignette in the introduction to the book, concerns an attempted concert by a white power band in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1995. And this was my personal introduction to ARA. I was finishing up my undergraduate degree at that time, and was asked to be part of a group of 100 people who agreed to basically have a picnic in a park which had been designated as the ticket handoff zone for this Nazi show. So excuse me, so neo-Nazis were going to be in the park and hand out tickets to anybody who came to go collect tickets at a secret location for the show itself. And so we occupied the park, and The people who were supposed to distribute the tickets never came, and a handful of Nazis drove into the park and saw us with a bunch of baseball bats, basically, and they left very quickly. And after that, the people who were on the ground in Minneapolis, I was not among them, had figured out where the actual venue for the show was, and they had been flyering the neighborhood and door knocking and getting people who lived in that neighborhood, which was a very diverse, multiracial community, agitated about this attempt of neo-Nazis to stage a show in their neighborhood. And by the time we got from the park to the venue, there were already 1,000 or more people from the neighborhood who were angry in the streets about the show. And the show itself never happened. The cops had to come and escort the Nazis out of their own venue, or the venue they had rented. And in my mind, it was an incredible victory for the combination of elements that I think made ARA really distinctive. So instead of being a very top-down, sort of centrally directed version of anti-fascism, it was grassroots and bottom-up, and it incorporated a wide range of sort of levels of militancy, I guess. The term diversity of tactics didn't exist at that point, but I think it was what we were doing without knowing that phrase. So that's one that I think is really distinctive. And then the other one is in a very different register, but I think equally important. And that was that despite the fact that we were and saw ourselves as a kind of militant minority, we were always trying to push a message of militant anti-fascism out to a much bigger audience. And so in the middle of the book, there's a chapter about the role that culture played in the work that we did. And just to highlight a couple of examples, ARA members and groups got write-ups in Vibe magazine in 1998 and in the magazine 17 in 2001. And I know people don't read print anymore, but in those years, that was a really important, massive audience that was encountering what ARA was about. And people were on tour with bands like Rage Against the Machine and the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. They were also, back when Lollapalooza was a tour, ARA toured with Lollapalooza for a couple of years, and also on the Warped Tour, which was a sort of alt-rock kind of thing. In other words, even though we had kind of our roots in this sort of countercultural, subcultural universe of a lot of punk and some hip-hop, people were really trying to push that beyond those limits and get into a more mainstream venue, which is in many ways, to go back to your question, sort of the opposite of how bigger, mainstream, supposedly anti-fascist organizations went about that business, which was to be in that mainstream so they could be, in the room with the Democratic Party or whatever. That was never our model, and we did, I think, the exact opposite.
I have just a follow-up question to that. What purpose do you think it serves? I know you get into this in the book, but what purpose do you think it serves, and what's the ultimate result of these other, organizations erasing or discrediting or sometimes even condemning some of the work that the ARA has done?
Yeah, in the book we talk briefly, but I think it's important about how the thing that held ARA together was this very, very short document that was called the 4 Points of Unity. And the title of the book, We Go Where They Go, is that first point of unity. And the second point of unity is that we don't rely on the cops and the courts. And that put us in stark contrast to, I'm thinking specifically of groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League that had carved out this kind of niche for themselves as they were the experts in anti-fascist research. And they were all busy feeding information to the police. And in particular, in the late 80s and early 90s, the ADL was actively feeding information about ARA itself to the police, which is consistent with their MO today in terms of saying they're anti-extremist and targeting left, and in our particular current moment, pro-Palestinian forces with every bit as much, if not more, kind of attention to what we're doing as they do to the far right. And so that, I think, for us was this line that we would never cross.
Yeah. So could you say a little bit more about what makes the ARA different from some of these other anti-fascist efforts?
Mm-hmm.
Or anti-racist, anti-fascist efforts, yeah.
Sure. So I would say there are a few things that I think are worth pointing out. And the big one is that we tried really hard to balance a level of militancy with, again, to go back to that phrase of diversity of tactics, and if people aren't familiar with it, it's a concept that basically says people are going to be at different comfort zones when it comes to what it means to be an anti-fascist. So you've got on the one extreme, you've got people that are willing to go out in the streets and get in fist fights or whatever, and then on the other end, you've got people who feel strongly about it, but don't feel for a variety of reasons, like that's safe or comfortable for them to do. And I think, were really able to balance that in a way that is, I don't know, I'm not going to say it's unique, but I think it was very special in that era of welcoming people in. And what that does, I think, is a couple of things. One is it maybe lowers the I don't know, macho factor, I guess, of the people who want to be street fighters, because they have to be in the same space and community with people who don't feel comfortable with that. And it also has the kind of countervailing effect of trying to get people who are not willing to take those kinds of direct actions themselves more comfortable with the notion that those have value, are legitimate, and can take place. And that, to me, put ARA apart, not just from those much more conservative, supposedly anti-fascist, oh boy.
Turn your phone off, Mike. Professor.
Supposedly anti-fascist conservative groups, but also in more recent times from, what, has been widely discussed since the beginning of the Trump era as Antifa, right? This idea that anti-fascism is only about small, secretive groups that will, get into direct militant confrontations with the far right. And again, while I think that has some value, it can't do its job by itself. And I think we've seen that, frankly, in the rise rather than the decline of the far right over the last decade.
I mean, I want to add something to it, just an observation of mine too, is like the decentralized nature of the ARA, I think is one thing that makes it stand out from some of these organizations. And even if you think about organizations that have national, like a national board or something that put out directives, like the ARA had convergences and things like that, but each chapter had autonomy pretty much to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
And so even, there were chapters that past the time that you covered in the book that were collaborating with Native American reservation and building a skate park with them. So just even doing things like that you wouldn't think of the ARA to do. And I think that's one of the things that also makes them different, is that anti-fascism can take lots of different forms, and working toward anti-fascism can look a lot of different ways. And the groups have the autonomy to explore what that can look like without this overhead.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, we had these 4 points of unity, and they're very basic. And within that, in terms of kind of strategic orientation, you could do what you thought made the most sense in your community. So yeah, we talked very briefly about a group in a town in Canada called Kitchener-Waterloo. It's a city, not a town, I guess, that had, kind of focused its efforts on building a community youth center. And there were other groups that did similar things in the US as well. And yeah, those counted, right? Those were every bit as important in our minds as, the kind of more adrenaline-charged stuff in the streets. So yeah, the decentralism, I think, was certainly a deliberate feature of the organization at the very beginning of the building of ARA. I think there was some concern about if we created a more centralized structure, that the really kind of experienced and serious and often manipulative far left sects would be able to kind of take that over. And so we wanted it to be a situation where people could sort of do their thing, and also, as you said, have the space to come together and have intense political debates, right? Have these arguments about why are we doing what we're doing? Is what you're doing, does that make sense? But it was never excluded on any sort of formal basis.
I want to just shift gears a little bit and talk about the like anti-fascism movement in the U.S. and a global push for anti-imperialism. And in my observation, and you kind of also like talk about this at various points in the book, that there wasn't always alignment in the way that those things were thought about between the ARA and anti-imperialist movements. So I wanted to ask you, how did anti-fascism and anti-imperialism, what are the ways in which they coincided, and what are the ways in which they didn't coincide in the ARA?
At the most basic level, because anti-imperialism is not mentioned in those 4 points of unity, there wasn't any kind of understood requirement that you had to have anti-imperialist politics, or that needed to be kind of essential to what you did as ARA. At the same time, as a practical matter, almost everybody who was involved in ARA in that particular period, I'm thinking especially from the late 80s into the early 2000s, shared some version of those politics. And I can speak for myself here. I came to ARA already having a developing connection to the Puerto Rican independence movement here in Chicago and beyond. And that mattered to me, right? I thought that what I was doing inside ARA was compatible and, supportive of that work. And it wasn't actually until I was working on this book that I learned that one of the very first fundraiser concert that ARA Chicago ever put together in 1989, long before I moved to town, was a benefit fundraiser for that same wing of the Puerto Rican independence movement that I later got connected to. So there are these kind of interesting little threads that draw those connections. At the same time, I think there are gaps because it wasn't a formalized, stated priority, right? It wasn't something that people were committing to when building an ARA group was anti-imperialism, in the same way that we were committing to anti-fascist organizing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Why do you think, so because to me, like as a Palestinian, they seem very like intertwined. Like it would be hard for me to think about anti-fascism without also thinking about anti-imperialism. So I'm wondering like why you think, because like to me it seems like a kind of like a blind spot, for lack of, well, I should use not that term, but it seems like an area that was overlooked. Yeah.
I think that's a fair criticism, and I think it depended really on where and when you're looking, right? So there are lots of places where that criticism would be very valid, and then there are other places. I want to highlight the work of a guy in Los Angeles named Michael Novick, who had come out of anti-imperialist, pro-Puerto Rican, pro-Palestinian framework, and that was infused into everything that the ARA group in Los Angeles did for all of the 1990s. But that was maybe the exception rather than the rule. If I'm trying to think about why that blind spot emerged, I think the primary thing is that when ARA was developing, there were different sorts of analysis that largely had to do with different maybe versions of radical politics. So at the early days of ARA, there were a lot of anarchists, but there were also a lot of Marxists of various stripes involved in ARA. Some, not all, but some of those anarchists had a fundamentally anti-nationalist standpoint in which they didn't necessarily distinguish, right, between different forms of nationalism. And they said all nationalism is bad nationalism. And that made them not very sympathetic to anti-imperialism. So that was a constituent group. It was never very large, but I think it was vocal because they had a sophisticated political analysis, even though it's not my analysis and one that I think is wrong. And that, I think, meant that when it came time to craft these points of unity, there was no possibility that there would be consensus around adding anti-imperialism. And consensus wasn't required, but the structure we had created said you needed a 2/3 majority to add something to the points of unity, basically. And that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that, I'm also an anarchist, and I disagree with that. It felt like a cop-out the first time I heard that argument, actually, because it was in reference to Palestine, where I was like, what's going on with Palestine, you guys? This is in 2005, maybe. And they were like, oh, we don't believe in any states. Yeah. It's like, okay, I got you. Okay. On that same vein, I'm wondering, as we think about fighting fascism and as we think about how, what happens here affects someone on the other side of the world, and, the benefits or the luxuries that I have come at the expense of the direct expense of someone else. So in an increasingly globalized world, how do we continue to meaningfully fight fascism in ways that are reflective of a global internationalist sort of solidarity?
So first, I want to say thank you for waiting until we're 15 minutes in before you ask the really hard question. Because it's a crucially important question, and I don't know that there is one single answer. I mean, ARA emerged in a time period where much of the left in the United States was looking inward because the Cold War had just ended, and it's before, after the Cold War and before 9/11. So there was just so much of this kind of focus on domestic politics. Not everybody had that, but a lot of people did. And so it was very easy, and I think in many ways appropriate, to focus on local organizing, right? What can you do locally to combat emergent far-right groupings in your locality? I think that work is really important. I think ARA over time became better at adopting an analysis of globalization, such that we were able, especially after the 9/11 events, to be able to say, look, we can't keep viewing this as isolated local things that only happen in the United States, right? There are issues here that are necessarily global, and we have to figure out how to address them. And frankly, we struggled. We didn't have an easy time of making that transition, and I think in some ways that is one of the things that became most debilitating to ARA in that time period. And we end the book sort of in this post 9/11 time period, and it's not like ARA stopped existing. There are ARA groups to this day, and there were many that were still active in the first decade of the 21st century. But we as authors found it difficult to kind of continue the same story because there were so many changes happening in the world and also in terms of how ARA was functioning that we sort of cut it off there. But one of the last things we try to address is how disorienting that experience was. And today, I would just say briefly that, we are in a world, when we were working on this, we were talking in our meetings for the book about Trump, but we were also talking about Bolsonaro in Brazil. We were talking about India, we were talking about Hungary, we were talking about the rightward tilt in Israel, right? All of these things were part of our conversations and necessarily have to be part of any kind of contemporary version of anti-fascism. But I don't know that I have a silver bullet to figure out how to do it on a global scale.
Why not? So what I'm hearing you say is basically within at least the groups that you were closely working with, 9/11 kind of forced the conversation, but it also illustrated the limits of the common ground between you and other groups. And I guess I'm wondering on that note, just to push a little bit further, when you think about things like weapons manufacturers in the U.S., that's such a easy target for, because it's you can potentially target these companies basically that are promoting and funding and giving weapons to fascist efforts in other places. So that is an anti-fascist effort. And at the same time, we have, there's so many contradictions, I think, that the left in the U.S. has to contend with before they can really start to think, I think, about things on that global perspective.
Yeah, I can offer one little tidbit that is a little bit different, but maybe related to what you're talking about. It's kind of fascinating because in the last, whatever it is now, 7-8 years, Madeleine Albright for a brief period was every mainstream Democrat's favorite anti-fascist. And those of you who have long enough memories know that she was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, and in particular was responsible for this horrifically devastating embargo that killed literally hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq before the the war in 2003. And ARA members in Columbus, Ohio, were part of what I think is one of these really amazing moments where we broke through into the mainstream, basically shutting down, or not completely shutting down, but getting national television because she did a live in-person town hall in Columbus, and I think this is the year 2000, maybe 99.
Before they knew how TV worked.
Yeah, exactly, and you know, and it's similar in some ways to the disruptions of a bunch of Biden's recent events by people, you know, trying to get him to support a ceasefire. There was this disruptive moment where people, you know, kind of made it very clear, very loudly, that Madeleine Albright was not on the right side of this fundamental question. And that, I think, was a really, like, a brief sort of shining moment of something that was really, one of those connections was really made in a powerful way. And, you know, those are exceptions maybe rather than the rule, but I think they're an important, if small, part of what we're trying to do in the book.
Yeah, it's interesting, Madeleine Albright, like when you bring her up too, because it's like, there's so many like people that would be considered like not heroes, but like the closest allies to the left, like within these organizations. But like also like as a Palestinian, like Madeleine Albright in particular was someone that was like particularly awful on Palestine, and so like I want to jump to a question that we talked about later to talk about. I'll put it now.
Sure.
But it's, you know, when we think about integrating into the communities that are like most affected by fascism, right? Or trying to give them some kind of say in what the organization does, for example. Because like I also want to address like some of the criticism, which you do talk about too in the book, and you address it. But you know, when I remember in Olympia, Washington, there was a situation where there were active like far right organizations that were like popping up and like doing violence in the community, and the local ARAs around then. This is like again past the time of the book, but the local ARAs were you know, engaging in like street altercations with the right wingers, and then there were some pretty prominent like people of color in the community that were condemning the ARA. And they were saying basically like, your actions are making us like unsafe, basically. You're not, we don't have a say in what you're doing. We're not voting on this action that you're engaging in, but by you engaging in this, it's going to bring more violence on us. Now, not that I agree with this like point of view or anything, but I just wanted to bring it up because I thought it kind of highlights there's sometimes a disconnect between the work that the ARA is doing or was doing, and then the communities that that are most affected by what they're fighting against, the, you know, the fascists, the right wing, and so on and so forth. So I guess the question is like, back then, what made people successful when they tried to like integrate in and learn, you know, even from the communities? Because like things like that, like with, you know, we could have told you that you know, Matt, no, I'm just kidding. But like, there's a lot of stuff I think that like predominantly like white leftist communities can learn from the communities that they are adjacent to, and like, you know, ultimately working to help support, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, rambling.
No, it's a really important issue, and I think there's a couple different ways that I would try to address it, and one that may, at least to some people, might sound like I'm dodging the question, so it's the first part of a two-part answer, is to say that there was a demographic issue inside ARA that is to say that many ARA groups were all or almost entirely white. And partly that had to do with some of the successes of those, like touring with all those bands, right? Going to all these concerts in the mid-90s helped create this very broad-based network that included ARA groups that were often, you know, for teenage friends in fairly small cities, places with 10,000, 20,000 people in far-flung parts of the United States. And many of those people because they lived in the particular kind of small town they lived in, and because they gravitated to ARA through punk rock, were exclusively white. And so that was a demographic reality that was often hard for ARA groups that were maybe more established, maybe sometimes more diverse, and often were situated in much larger and more diverse cities to try and navigate. And so the kind of, I don't think it was created as a rationalization, but it could appear that way perhaps. But I think it's an important point, which is that if you are working with young white people, and I think we see this today as well, they are in many ways, especially young white men, the target audience for the far right and their organizing efforts. So that there was value in some people's minds, and I think I was occasionally of this opinion, that there was value in deliberately organizing with white youth to recruit them effectively away from the fascists and toward an anti-fascist politics. At the same time, the second part of my answer would be that for people inside ARA, this was not everybody, but for the people who were trying to think about a political analysis to develop through anti-fascist work, there was a totally unresolved, never resolved tension between a kind of advocacy for building multiracial political organizations on the one hand, and on the other hand, effectively a kind of white solidarity model that said we actually shouldn't recruit people of color to our groups because the sort of a version of a kind of nationalist politics in communities of color says that those people should be in those groups, not in a multiracial group. And that was a dividing line that never grew into a split. There were, as far as I'm aware, no ARA groups or members left because of that disagreement, but it was also never resolved. There was no attempt to kind of have a debate and say, okay, now ARA is firmly on this side or firmly on that side. And that meant that there were ARA groups, we talk about Detroit, for instance, that are majority black in a majority black city, and they functioned in a very different way than a majority white small crew in a mostly white small town might have functioned. So again, maybe it's the pro and the con of that decentralization that we talked about before.
And I mean, you talk about the area also like collaborating with like groups like Mecha and like other like organizations too that like have similar or like common aims at least. And I think like there have been times, like for example, the mosque that I grew up going to had some man shoot into it at one point. I don't remember what year it was, but around that time, the South Side area was still functioning, and they reached out to me and they were like, "Do you guys need like help? Like, do you want us to come and like stake out and whatever?" And I ended up saying no, because I thought that a community would probably be more freaked out by those guys than they might think that they were like fascists, right? And so I think that also becomes like a tension point of like even trying to build like community, because like what I said to them was that I think there needs to be community built between the like Southside area and this like Arab American community before like break bread, like do like, it sounds corny, but like it is, I think, important to like build those like community spaces where you can at least interact with people in a not in a high stakes environment before those stakes start to rise.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I mean, I think Chicago, when I was involved, especially in the early 2000s, was a sort of interesting case because we were, at a certain point, a pretty diverse group. And in particular, I'm thinking about the example that you offered, that there were a couple of Palestinian members of ARA for a couple of years in 2000, 2002, roughly. And near the end of that time, there was this big Al-Awda organized this big right of return rally and march in downtown Chicago, and because the two people who were in ARA were also connected to that organizing effort, Al-Awda Chicago actually asked ARA to be part of basically the security for that rally. But that, again, you're right, it has to come from these connections, and if you don't have the connections, it's always difficult to know how do you build them in the first place. And often, in my experience, they get built outside of explicitly political spaces. They get built by making decisions about what neighborhood you live in, what, if you're a parent, where do your kids go to school, and who do you know through your job, and all of those sorts of daily life experiences can really transform the sorts of political opportunities that are available to people. And sometimes ARA groups were really good at that, and sometimes they weren't so good at that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll throw you an easy one now, because you're like.
Thank you.
I as a professor, I always assign writing collective documents, and that was something that I picked up from working, or when I went to Evergreen State College was the first time I ever got an assignment like that, where I was told to write with other people in one document. That's how journal articles are written and all of this. So it is, I think, a little bit different too, especially when you're writing with people that are not from your same academic training, because I have also noticed when I sometimes have to write with someone that's trained in sociology or something else, some other field even within psychology, it's so different that it's hard to write. And I'm wondering what that process was like for you to write with so many authors from such different backgrounds.
Yeah, and to make the point even more stark, in my academic field in history, you almost never co-write. It's very unusual. It's almost always single author.
Oh, okay.
So my academic background had not prepared me for this at all. And I am also the only academic among the 4 co-authors. And so it was a really fascinating experience to work on this book, and it was totally unlike anything else I've ever done. I was sort of brought into this very amorphous idea that there were at one point, I think, 2 or even 3 different sort of loosely grouped collections of people that were thinking about writing a history of ARA, and then they kind of got together, and then some people joined and some people left, and somewhere late in that process I was brought in, and that happened to be in January of 2020. And at the time I said, well, I love this project, but I don't know how much time I have to commit to it. I'm very busy. And so, lo and behold, this became our collective pandemic project, right? And we all drafted different portions of the book, and it was not even. It wasn't like each of us drafted 25% of the pages or anything like that. There were people who did more initial work and people who did more editing work. But everybody read everything more times than we can count. And we also then we would meet every Sunday on Zoom, a minimum of 2 hours. Sometimes I think the longest probably went 6 or 7 hours of just continuous Zoom conversations among the 4 of us, having to do with everything from signing a contract to structuring the chapters to editing text line by line at certain points. It was a very, very collaborative process, really unlike anything else I've ever done. And it is, I think, a much better book because of that. So 3 of the 4 of us were in ARA in different places, and then the 4th is much younger, and kind of learned about ARA as a teenager and got really interested in the topic. And so we had very different perspectives and very different voices. And I don't know how anybody else reads the book. When I read it now, when I look at it, it feels smoother, certainly, than it did when we were drafting it, when you could tell, oh, that's something that Mike wrote and that's something that Lady wrote. It doesn't, in my mind, feel quite like that. But it was an incredible bond that the 4 of us developed over, I don't know, I think we did those Zoom meetings every week for 18 months, something like that.
Who wrote the jokes?
That was Shannon.
Okay. They were funny.
The anti-fascist tree, did you like that one?
Yeah, they were funny. I wrote ha-ha a lot in the margin.
Shannon has a really lovely and very dry sense of humor.
I appreciate that.
I'm sorry, can I add one more thing about the process
that
is super important? We wrote too much, and we had a manuscript that was way too long, and in order to get it shorter, we hired an outside editor, and she was amazing. She had a kind of a radical background in Canada, and was sort of familiar with some of the history from a different perspective. And she's a professional at this, and she was incredible. She cut, I can't remember, 18, 20% of our words, and it didn't feel like she cut anything that was too good to leave out. So that was an absolutely crucial piece, was this fifth voice that came in at the very end.
That's a good point. Okay. So I have just a couple more questions for you. So thinking about the book, and like as I'm reading it, I was thinking about other organizing that's happening in the U.S., and I was thinking about other, like lessons and things like that that we can learn from the history of the ARA. And I'm wondering, in what ways do you see the book as a political intervention today, and not just like as a historical document or a collection of these experiences?
Yeah, that was absolutely the intention from the very start. And, the four of us have different degrees of ongoing involvement in political action. Mine at this point is very limited, but we really wanted to craft something that was informative but also useful, right? We didn't want it to just be this sort of story about the past. We wanted it to be a thing that could actually allow for strategic changes in kind of how left organizing, particularly anti-fascist organizing, happens. Literally just a couple days ago, we have we all text in a little loop, and one of our co-authors informed the rest of us that there was, of course, on the anniversary of January 6th, the Proud Boys tried to hold a rally in Ohio, and the organizing for it was at least partially initiated by somebody who had read our book and advertised it as, this is a different way we can do this, right? We have these options that will be different. And as a result, there was a much larger counter-protest presence than there had been at similar rallies in the past in Ohio in the recent past. And the co-author said, well, then afterwards, there were these personality conflicts and that coalition kind of imploded. And so it's not a perfect lesson, but it's exactly what we'd hoped would happen, is that people would look at this and say, aha, there are things we could be doing that we're not doing. And so, yeah, it was absolutely intended to be a political intervention from the very beginning.
Yeah. So I want to bring it to like a, contemporary, like political action that's going on right now, and ask you, in terms of like the things that you could be doing but aren't doing, or just generally the similarities and differences between what you're seeing with, like, for example, Cop City and with ARA organizing.
Yeah, this is one that I've talked about, and I think my co-authors have all talked about it in different ways at different events that we've done. I've been, I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I've been really inspired by what has been happening with the Stop Cop City actions in Atlanta. And I think, now certainly everything has changed in some ways because so many people are under indictment right now. But the work that they had done, I think, really did have these echoes of some of the stuff that ARA held dear. In particular, they were really focused on broadening their coalition through culture, right? Having concerts in the forest that they were occupying, I think, was this kind of brilliant idea, because it got people out there who had very different sort of approaches to thinking about, why is this important? It's educational, but it's also building a community, and a community that is, again, kind of embodied a diversity of tactics. At the same time, I think the difference is every bit as much in terms of the repression. Yes, ARA faced a certain amount of state repression, but it was really strikingly limited compared to what's happening now in terms of these mass indictments against people that are active in Stop Cop City. So, one of the things we try to say in the legacy chapter at the end is that times have changed, and there are reasons, valid reasons, why people have opted for a more security culture orientation in terms of anti-fascist organizing. At the same time, we think there is some place for this broad-based attempt to build broader coalitions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't have any idea what time it is.
Yeah, so we are kind of just heading to the end. We did want to have a couple of questions from our online audience, people that are watching our live stream.
Thank you.
So there was one about lessons for activists of today that I think you kind of answered. So I'm just going to ask, the time period you write about is before social media existed and the internet was still young. Can you comment on how anti-racist activists, as well as white power groups, use social media and the internet for good and bad?
Well, I mean, obviously that's a huge topic. I think that what I would say is one of the things that ARA was good at in its era was navigating new and emerging technologies. And, of course, those technologies seem ancient to us, who uses email, right? Those sorts of things. But it wasn't about the specific technology. It was about trying to understand and utilize the tools that were available. And I think that that's the same issue emerges in terms of how do you navigate social media, with the difference being that in general, emails are private unless somebody happens upon them, and social media is largely very public, and that causes a certain number of headaches, but also provides certain opportunities. So I don't know that I can offer a better answer than that. Do you have thoughts on that particular question?
I mean, there was a time when the cops didn't know how to use Twitter. And I remember
that was the first context in which I heard of Twitter, was people saying, okay, we're using this new tool to coordinate this protest.
Yeah. I was like, cool. And I mean, I think that, the far right uses the internet to organize through these webs. I mean, they've had Stormfront is still functioning, I'm pretty sure, and there's I'm sure tons and tons of white power Facebook groups where they're able to organize, and I think that it makes it easier for them to find each other, but I think it also makes it easier for everyone to find each other. So I mean, I guess it changes the terrain. Yeah. But I think it's kind of affecting everybody. Everybody has to contend with it, and because the internet kind of is still one of the things that is relatively accessible to everybody. So
at the risk of being disheartening about it, I think in the era that we're describing, our side got tech and their side didn't, and now the bad guys get it, right? They know how to use it, and they use it well, and it's a very successful tool for them. And that's a big problem that I don't know how to resolve, but it is something that's very different from what we were dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more from the online audience. So I'm interested in the way you write the book as an oral history with lots of different people telling stories. Why did you decide to present the history that way instead of more traditionally?
It really was organic. I don't remember there being a moment where we said, aha, what we need to do here is interview a bunch of people. I think some of it, this is my little historian hat, what are your sources, what's your evidence base? Almost nobody wrote about us, There were no newspaper articles, we didn't break through in that way, with the exception of Vibe and 17. And so when we went looking for how do we document what happened, the only options we had really were internal documents, which we had tons of. There was an active discussion bulletin that was printed and mailed to people all across the country. But then also talking to people who were there, and doing all of these oral history interviews just made sense. And what I think is great about it, and I'm glad the person asked the question, is that it meant that even though, yeah, there were 4 of us working on the book, you're getting, I don't know, 50 different perspectives in the course of reading. And that, I think, was a really crucial decision that we made in terms of trying to validate those perspectives, because everybody had a different perspective on what we were doing and why we were doing it and what came out of it. So to hear multiple voices, I think, was a really important thing that we did.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time a little bit, so we have time for probably one question from the crowd. Do you want to?
Okay. Hi. I'm Daryl for people in the audience. I was a comrade of Mike from the ARA, and also I'm a resident in the Austin area for a long time as well. And I guess the thing I wanted to say is that we as a group at the time in Chicago, we were involved in addressing institutionalized racism, and also made the connection between anti-fascism and fighting for queer liberation too.
Yeah, Daryl, I'm so happy you're here. And absolutely, in various ways, Chicago was part of this kind of ongoing discussion about how much time and effort do you put into kind of fighting with these, at that time, what felt like very small groupings of fascists, versus how much time do you put into things like organizing against police brutality, or against organizing rent strikes, or whatever it is, like various important forms of institutionalized racism. And I think that you're also pointing to the significant involvement that ARA had in a variety of ways around queer organizing, and that was something that we do talk a little bit about in the book, in a chapter that also touches on defense of reproductive rights as well. And that was, I would say, I was thinking about this when we were talking about anti-imperialism, where that never, got added into the points of unity. There is this debate that happens in 1998, and defense of reproductive rights in particular does get added to the points of unity. It's really the only substantive change in those points of unity during the time that we're writing about. And that is definitely something that we tried to address in the book.
So that brings us to the conclusion of the program. We want to thank both our speakers for being here this evening. And a friendly reminder, we do have books for sale, and Dr. Michael Staudenmaier will be signing the books.